Hello everyone, I'm John Raymer. Allow me to take a moment and discuss with you actions we can take as an industry to further improve flexible mitigation strategies beyond its primary role of mitigating extended loss of power type of an event where we wind up being challenged in our ability to remove heat from the fuel source and transfer it to the ultimate heat sink. Flexible mitigation strategies is essentially a booster shot to the emergency safeguard feature system. Um, when they went and designed this, they took a look at what they had going on and they realized that they could only what if a scenario so far before everything sort of started to fall apart. And in the source documents for Flex, it's actually covered as such. Um, and the actual capabilities of Flex with regards to that are sort of unknowns. Nobody's really had to use it a whole lot. There are certain times where we're more vulnerable to a beyond design basis event or other type thing. During a refueling outage, for example, and that's not necessarily covered in Flex, or say scenarios where you have an extended casualty, an extended flood, an extended loss of power, the breakdown of society, roads not functioning anymore, can't get anything anywhere. And then you could have an opportunistic adversary or an inside threat during a beyond design basis event to go and further complicate matters. Here we have a cross-sectional view of what appears to be a pressurized water reactor containment and its auxiliary building housing the spent fuel pool. Now this is important to bring up because any licensed reactor operator, which I imagine there are a few of watching this presentation, um, can tell you when you're at mid-loop in a refueling outage, your time to boil drops substantially. We'll be taking fuel out here, putting it through the transfer canal, and moving it into the spent fuel pool. This is a highly dynamic situation, and the time to boil in all of these places, it changes multiple times with each fuel move. So at this point, if something was to happen which was to jeopardize our ability to, remove the latent heat of criticality from any of these areas and get it transferred either to whatever essential service water cools this down or your shutdown cooling system, your RHR system, you're going to find yourself in an interesting scenario, especially if you can't maintain covered, then you're looking at more likely to have that sort of fuel failure. Here we have a picture taken from a helicopter. This is a weekend, if I remember right, right after our Aqua Dam failed around Fort Calhoun Nuclear Station in Nebraska. Now, this is important because in emergency safeguard features, it specifically discusses flooding. One of the flooding scenarios is, say you have an upstream dam fail in flexible mitigation strategies. Well, it says the plant might have 6 hours, before, so it can take action to prevent whatever the wall of water is coming down. And then the amount of time you have to go and cope with this could be hours to days, or in this case it was months. Now, what you have here is about 18 miles crossed of 3 feet deep water in the Missouri River Basin that followed a record amount of snowfall and rainfall across Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. If you remember the Oroville Dam from California and what was going on there, if you can picture about a half dozen of those upstream from here that were all just letting go one to the next one to the next one to the next one, and there was no stopping it, and the water really wasn't going down in those reservoirs. And there we were downstream of that, shut down towards the end of a refueling outage, looking to start. We did not get started back up before this came through. Now, we had surrounded the plant with this Aqua Dam, and about a week before we got that Aqua Dam, we went and took some additional measures to go and add an alt to our fuel oil tanks. Right here in the picture is about FO10, that's under about 3 feet of water. We put a standpipe on that for filling it. We also did it over here on FO1, which would be the fuel tank for our emergency diesel generators. And there's about 30,000 gallons of diesel fuel oil here. Now this is the middle of summer, so this other fuel oil tank, which is combined for both our auxiliary boiler and our diesel generators, was not necessary. But had this happened in the winter, we wouldn't necessarily have a way to get more fuel oil down to that very readily without going through several security fences and across about a mile of water. It would be challenging to say the least. So your buildings would start getting cold as that aux boiler ran out of fuel and things would start freezing. You'd lose your amount of fuel oil over here in FO1, and then if you lost offsite power for any reason, well, all of a sudden you're in a case where, hey, how do we get power here to keep cooling things down? Fortunately, we had quite a bit of time to deal with that at the time, but had this happened at a less opportune time, we'd probably still be hearing about Fort Calhoun. Adversaries. When a lot of people talk about adversaries, this is kind of where we go anymore, and this is what our security is trained to prevent. A group of armed individuals going and seeking to perform hostilities upon a commercial nuclear power plant, containment doors open, release fission products to the environment any way they can. But the more likely adversary is someone like this, a disgruntled employee who has some personal reason, or perhaps he's sympathetic to some other cause, to go and find a beyond design basis event occurring on their shift, and they're in a position where they can go and complicate matters even worse. Not saying this will happen, but it's something that isn't necessarily covered by flexible mitigation strategies. And in that case, you're beyond design basis, and you're losing some of your emergency safeguard features and possibly some of your flexible mitigation strategies, procedures. And that is not a comfortable position to be in. Which brings us back to, Fukushima and what happened there. We just became more likely to have that event. Well, Fukushima is into the remediation portion of its lifespan right now, where they're dealing with trying to clean things up. And one of the big problems they have is fission products that are trapped in liquids. And here's a cross-sectional view of more or less what happens with groundwater. Groundwater flows from upstream to downstream, or high pressure to low pressure. I don't know a whole lot, never had having to work on an ocean where you have tides and everything else, but this radioactive groundwater flowing from uphill and down and out into the ocean is somewhat correct, although I can say locally the ocean also kind of flows back against this ice wall here. Also, it's three-dimensional, so what you're not seeing is whatever the ocean current does, whether it's going south down the coast of Japan or up north, the groundwater also tends to kind of follow that. So, they spent 300 million pounds to go and build this ice wall around Fukushima to prevent the groundwater from getting in, causing more contaminated liquid that they had to deal with, and also potentially to keep stuff inside of the ice wall from getting out into the Pacific Ocean. So that's the concern, releasing fission products into the environment in an unmonitored fashion. What they found was that it was more or less not entirely successful. It did reduce the amount of groundwater in leakage by approximately 10%, but for the cost, they didn't necessarily get the bang they were hoping for on their buck. They were hoping for 100% stop. Well, 10%? They had two numbers, correct? So what can we do? We just looked at, what's happened with Fukushima and other things. We put ourselves in a beyond design basis event where there's no recovery from. Early on, I had an introduction where I talked about what if we had, Fukushima happen at Catawba, which would affect some 2 million people in the 50-mile emergency planning zone near Charlotte, North Carolina. Well, in the event of a Fukushima, Charlotte, North Carolina still gets covered with contamination if Flex fails to do its job and maintain the fission product boundaries intact. We can possibly deal with those radionuclides later by collecting runoff in storm sewers and trying to filter them out mechanically or through ion exchange. But we will have at the plant, we will have a large amount of liquid radioactive waste. We'll have a waste processing facility. Those only work so fast, and chances are good we're going to be generating this contaminated radioactive liquid faster than we can store it in a tank. So we are going to have to figure out something to do quickly to deal with that. There are solutions to that, fortunately. Waste ROs and ion exchangers function very well, and what we need to try to remove here is our long-term fission products. Cesium, strontium, and your transuranics. So, discussed using an ion exchanger, and we can also, anything we use, your pump trucks, your portable pumps, those are going to wind up being highly contaminated at the end of the day, and you're not necessarily going to have a good place to put those. So we can start looking at, can we build an on-site waste disposal facility? Maybe it's a mausoleum, maybe it's someplace in the ground. Here we have, this is a condensate polisher setup, but it would function similarly to removing, your fission products. Whether or not you want to use anion resin in this is a good question, because if you're looking at how much of our fuel failed, do we have fuel in this water, and are we going to turn this ion exchanger, are we going to turn an ion exchanger potentially into a reactor if we deborate this water, is something that needs to be taken into consideration when we're talking about a, reactor accident. This is basically what a condensate polisher trailer looks like, believe it or not. Those 6 beds we just saw, well, they're in this trailer, and actually it works pretty good. Um, can't necessarily operate this remotely. You'll have to get somebody in there, and dose rates coming off the ion exchange vessels could be a concern. Um, the nice thing about this is it's scalable, and it's a lot cheaper than 300 million pounds. We can utilize existing equipment. As I said, there's going to be limitations on that, and we can utilize flex equipment to deal with this. Talked about the radiation, talked about maintaining your boron, maintaining your shutdown margin. Now we also discussed, on-site waste disposal facilities. Really, the only thing that's important here is to get the legwork done, to find a suitable location where we can put this, so that when something like this happens, if there's already a site chose with a bunch of the legwork done, this can get accomplished a lot quicker. We're going to waste a lot less money, time, and effort, and dose in dealing with this. We're not going to put something in the wrong place where it winds up having a release. And if you're talking about solidifying your resin at the end of the day, your main goal is to do whatever you can to keep those radionuclides in a solid phase and not mobile in a liquid or an airborne phase. And realistically, in a game of moral relativism here, the solid underground is a lot less threat for dose concerns to the public than a liquid drying up, going airborne, blowing across the river to a city, or getting in the waterways and going downstream into somebody's water treatment facility where they wind up drinking it. So this is what we're looking at here. No, this would probably be extremely expensive to build that, and we talked about why we brought that up. So, to go back through all this, Mr. Walters discussed the events of Fukushima and how we as an industry responded to that. Mr. Bunyan followed it up by covering the overview of what Flex is with regards to mitigating this type of Fukushima or Chernobyl type disaster from occurring within the United States. And I went and discussed what we can do in the event where we had something like that happen, how we could possibly incorporate some more equipment and some more, if you will, surveying into our existing Flex procedures so that we're on a better footing to deal with something of that scale. That concludes my portion of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening.